It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. We're at the end of the month of Toho monster films that did not star Godzilla, but we've got about as good of a next best thing as you can get in the form of the King of Skull Island himself in King Kong Escapes. I think we all know who this King Kong character is. However, the origin of this movie is actually kind of interesting. Of course, in 1962, Toho cut a deal with RKO, who owned the rights to King Kong at the time, to make King Kong vs. Godzilla. It was the first time Godzilla was in a film after a 7-year break, and it was the first time in nearly 30 years for Kong. And it was a pretty damn good monster battle movie that kicked off nearly 15 years of dominance for Godzilla on the big screen in terms of movies being imported from Japan. Now, King Kong Escapes is less a sequel to King Kong vs. Godzilla and more of a remake. But what could it possibly be remaking? Well, in the mid to late 60s, there was an anime-style King Kong cartoon that kind of retold elements from the original film from 1933, with some things kind of changed. So Takeshi Kimura took some of that and threw in a mad scientist plot in the form of a guy named Doctor Who, but not the mad British time traveler, just a mad scientist guy from someplace in Asia named Doctor Who. This doctor was modeled a little bit more after something else that was extremely popular in the mid-60s, and that is James Bond villains. And in particular, it was the villains Dr. No and Blofeld. Now, speaking of Bond, this film co-stars Mie Hama, who played Kissy Suzuki in the Sean Connery film You Only Live Twice. But King Kong is not alone in terms of monsters in this film. We also see Gorosaurus. Now, Gorosaurus is a lot more like a typical dinosaur type of monster. I mean, he's kind of easily forgotten in the world of Toho monsters, mostly because after creatures like Godzilla, and then much later on in Godzilla's final Showa era film, you had Titanosaurus. Those turned out to be, of course, Titanosaurus is the one that really kind of takes up a lot of the extra attention that another dinosaur type creature like a Godzilla would appear in. But he's kind of easily, not only is he kind of easily forgotten, but after King Kong Escapes, he does appear in Destroy All Monsters, and then had stock footage cameos in All Monsters Attack and Godzilla vs. Gigan. He did later appear in 92 episodes of Godzilla Island, and then several more episodes of Gozaban. And in Godzilla Final Wars, he doesn't so much as appear, but he is represented as a toy that somebody has in that movie. And in 1972, Gorosaurus also appeared in an episode of Toho's tokusatsu series Go Godman. Now, we also get ourselves a very neat robotic Kong in this film, dubbed, and this is so clever, Mechanicong. I love that name. Mechanicong is built in this film by Doctor Who, and he also appeared in the King Kong animated series later on. And he would go on to inspire the concept of my favorite villain character in a Godzilla movie, Mechagodzilla, for the 1974 and 75 films featuring that mechanical Big G. Now, originally, there was an attempt by Toho in 1991 to make a Godzilla vs. Mechanicong, but Turner Broadcasting owned the rights to King Kong as an image at the time and demanded payment for that usage of King Kong's image. So Toho decided to not pay for that, scrap that idea, and we got one of the greatest of the Heisei entries, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, instead. And what did Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah feature? A Ghidorah that was revived by way of cybernetics to create Mecha King Ghidorah, which was, of course, inspired by Mechagodzilla, which, of course, was inspired by Mechanicong. This was also a Rankin Bass production. This was actually a co-production between the U.S. and Japan at the time. So it does have more American actors in this, like Rhodes Reason, who was in about 200 movies and TV shows in his career, and Linda Jo Miller, who eventually also appeared in the Japanese film The Green Slime. She's also a regular of various conventions, particularly of G-Fest and All Monsters Attack. But Rankin Bass is best known for all those classic holiday movies that you see, like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, The Little Drummer Boy, Frosty the Snowman, Santa Claus is Coming to Town, and several more. Finally, our lead in this movie, Rhodes Reason, might look and sound very familiar to monster kids everywhere. And you might think he looks an awful lot like the guy who was in This Island Earth and The Creature Walks Among Us. Well, that's because the star of those two Universal classics is Rex Reason, who is Rhodes Reason's older brother. The movie begins on a submarine headed for Mondo Island to look for a mythical giant ape, who of course we know is King Kong. Now this sub is commanded by Carl Nelson, who's played by Rhodes Reason, and his crew also includes his second in command, Jiro Nomura, and the lovely Lieutenant Susan Watson, played by Miller. Elsewhere, Doctor Who is visited by Madame Piranha, played by Mihama. Now, Madame Piranha wants to know what Doctor Who is up to, and he says he has this mechanical version of King Kong that will do whatever he says and will mine for this extremely radioactive material called Element X. Element X is apparently only found at the North Pole and is useful to their needs. They don't exactly say what the needs are, but whatever. When Doctor Who doesn't get the results that Madame Piranha wants, and when she wants them, she is known to basically give him hell over it. She oftentimes is threatening to withhold money from her quote-unquote country that she represents. So she does kind of have a boss kind of attitude toward this mad scientist that is kind of creating things for this international interest. It's almost like Madame Piranha not only has the cooler name, but definitely the boss lady of the bad guys. Now, Madame Piranha gets her chance to rail on Doctor Who when his Mechanicong circuits are fried by the radiation absorbed by mining for Element X. So Doctor Who decides maybe he can just go get the real King Kong to finish the mining job. After all, King Kong doesn't have circuits. He's flesh and bone, flesh and blood and bone and all that stuff. So surely that won't be affected by radiation, right? Right? Anyway, Nelson, Nomura, and Susan go ashore on this place called Mondo Island. There, they are warned to go no further by the lone native on this island who says they are trespassing on King Kong's land. It's fair to say that this movie is not really connected to any other King Kong movie. King Kong is treated more as a legend than a thing that just a few years before fought Godzilla. So when Nelson and Nomura leave Susan back at their ship so that they can kind of see if there are any other natives on this island, and basically take a look around at everything and figure out what this King Kong thing is, Susan sees a giant dinosaur, and that's our Gorosaurus, and she screams in terror, which awakens Kong, and he comes to check things out. And when he sees Susan, he instantly takes a shine to her. Think of her as this movie's version of Fay Wray's Ann Darrow. She's a blonde lady who screams. That is right up Kong's alley there. And Kong moves Susan to safety and takes on Gorosaurus, who has a nifty kick attack that knocks King Kong around like a chump. But Kong eventually gets in close and knocks Gorosaurus to the ground and then basically beats the hell out of him. Nelson and Nomura reunite with Susan, and they escape as Gorosaurus comes back for another round of beatings. This time, Kong kills the dinosaur by doing his typical thing where he breaks the dino's jaws. And as Nelson pilots their craft back to their submarine, a giant sea serpent tries attacking them. Kong, realizing that Susan is on that craft, comes out into the water and fights the serpent to help them get away. But that's not enough for Kong. He then goes out to the sub and begins rocking the thing to get the crew's attention so that he can see Susan again. And she goes to ask Kong to stop messing with the boat because that's where she lives and eats and sleeps. But he picks her up and tries to take her back to the island instead of letting her down so that she can go back inside the submarine. After begging him to put her back onto the sub, she just jumps out of his hand and into the water. And this shows Kong that she wants to be back on her sub with her people. So he does the right thing by picking her up out of the water, taking her back to the sub, and then returning to Mondo Island. Now, after returning to the UN, Nelson presents his and his crew's findings about Kong. And Madame Piranha is actually there to find out more about how Kong was so easily pacified by a lone person. And Nelson makes it no secret that Kong is a big old primate and Susan's a pretty girl. So yeah, Kong did what Susan asked because he was sweet on her. And this leads to Doctor Who abducting Kong to carry out his plan to have the big monkey mine for that element X at the North Pole. When the same local trying to warn Nelson off the island does the same to Doctor Who, the evil scientist shoots the guy in cold blood. Shortly after that, Nelson and his crew return to Mondo Island to try to find Kong, but discover that he's missing. And they also find that the native has been shot. The native tells Nelson, Nomura, and Susan that a devil came and took Kong. And Nelson quickly deduces that this old man was referring to his own old nemesis, Doctor Who. Nelson's confident that they will be able to find Kong as long as they haven't taken him to the North Pole. So anyway, at the North Pole, Doctor Who sets about his plan to make Kong do what he wants to mine that element X. And how do you get Kong to do what you want when you don't have any pretty blondes around? Well, apparently you just hypnotize him. After doing so, they fit him with an earpiece so that Doctor Who can directly send him orders. Doctor Who sends Kong into the mine to get the element X while he and Madame Piranha watch on. However, element X messes with the earpiece and basically once again instantaneously ruins Doctor Who's plans. Who's men have brought Nelson, Nomura, and Susan to his hideout, and Madame Piranha tries to seduce Nelson as Who wants Susan to basically tell Kong to dig for the element X. However, all of this fails anyway because Kong busts free, and so do our heroes. Who sends Mechanic Kong out after the real Kong, and Kong arrives in Japan with Who then basically catching up to them, telling Mechanic Kong to chase after the real Kong, and the two face off in where else but Tokyo. After a short battle between the two, Mechanic Kong picks up Susan, and basically this forces Kong to basically relent and do what Doctor Who wants, which is return to the ship to work for him to get element X, or as Doctor Who says, he'll just let Mechanic Kong drop Susan and kill her. However, for some reason, and there was very clear, Doctor Who says, go back to the ship and we're going to go back to the North Pole and we're going to mine for element X. But for whatever reason, Mechanic Kong decides to climb up Tokyo Tower, which Kong then follows because he wants to save Susan. Eventually, Kong does succeed in saving both Susan and destroying Mechanic Kong by fighting him off until he ultimately loses his grip and falls from the tower to his destruction. Then, as the morning arrives, Kong then chases after Doctor Who and his gang of baddies. He catches up to the villains before they can launch from the harbor. And basically, Susan says, go stop that ship. And by stopping Doctor Who's ship, I guess that means he basically just destroys it and sinks it, killing everybody on board. Satisfied with the amount of murder that he just committed, Kong swims back to his home island after a job well done. But let's get to the three things I like about King Kong Escapes. First, I like that there is basically no bullshit leading up to Mechanic Kong. Okay, we get to meet the good guys first, but moments after that, we're introduced to Doctor Who and Madame Piranha, and then bam, Mechanic Kong is shown to us. it's a glorious beast too. I mean, for as kind of dopey as King Kong kind of looks in King Kong versus Godzilla and this movie, Mechanic Kong looks fantastic. He does come off as more ape-like in his appearance and looks more directly related to the original Kong than Toho's version. But never mind that there's no real reason for this thing to mine for Element X looking like a giant gorilla, let alone King Kong, which is mostly a legend and not something that Doctor Who or Nelson know for sure exist. And apparently Doctor Who also knows it's powerful enough to do what he wants, basing his entire robot around it. You know what? Forget it. It's a bitchin' robot monkey and I love it, and that's good enough for me. Second, man, does this movie get started quick. We see Mechanic Kong in the opening minutes. We then quickly get Kong himself along with Gorosaurus and the giant serpent. So if I thought that, the first was the movie wasting no time showing us the money shot that is the robot monkey on all the promotional material, it spent no extra time giving us the rest of the monster cast, as the first act reveals all of this to us. So you have to appreciate a movie that knows not to spend any time wasting and having us wait around for our lead monster. The first act is all about getting all the pieces into place and all of the characters introduced to us, and then setting up that kind of classic Beauty and the Beast storyline that Kong is best known for, which is there are a lot of really sweet scenes with with the Susan character in Kong, and it really does fit nicely into the King Kong myth and the whole legend and the whole series of Kong movies. It does fit in nicely with that. But the second act is all about Doctor Who and his crazy Element X mining plot. And then the third act is our monster battle where eventually Kong will come out victorious. It's nicely constructed and it's quick to get to the point, and it's just a heck of an efficient movie. Third, I think the whole Doctor Who storyline is kind of interesting in a few ways. First, it's a way to give a little more content to a movie about King Kong needing to fight some other monsters. If you are going to have a real Kong fight a robot Kong, well, somebody had to have built the robot Kong, so let's have this guy here, right? Second, you have a very Japanese science fiction plot. Again, you have the monsters. You're going to have a lot of science fiction plot that's dealing with like radioactive material. That seems very Japanese in nature. It sets right up into all of the other Japanese science fiction films of this time. However, my favorite thing is just simply how bad at being a mad scientist mastermind Doctor Who is, and how much you can see Madame Piranha seething with hatred of him and being fed up with all of his failures. He builds this giant robot that she paid for, and it fails spectacularly. He then wants to take control of Kong, but that fails spectacularly too. They end up capturing Nelson, Nomura, and Susan, but there's not much Who is doing that is really all that threatening, honestly. He even tries to force Nelson to cooperate with him by threatening to free Susan and Nomura, but Nelson just kind of refuses. He just sits there. He does not bargain with him at all for the lives of his crew. So what does Doctor Who do next? Well, he's forced to directly try to threaten the two of them to get Susan, and the two of them being Nomura and Susan, to help him control Kong. So even that doesn't even really work for him. And I guess he's kind of a crazy enough mad scientist to try over and over and over again to succeed that maybe someday one of his ideas will work out. But he is kind of a complete loser, and it does feel like an arch nemesis from a cartoon series who is always threatening but is never succeeding, because either he himself doesn't plan for mistakes or he has dopey henchmen or whatever. It just tickles me that he's so impotent as a villain. And that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. And you can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Next time, I have Terror Times 3 with an all-time classic anthology that features a hell of a series of performances from Karen Black in the 1975 Dan Curtis cult classic Trilogy of Terror. Until next week, stay spooky.